The Secrets of Doctor Who is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous supporters. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/donate. You're listening to The Secrets of Doctor Who, episode 146.
One day, I shall come back.
That's it. I've been renewed.
Is when a Time Lord's body wears out, he regenerates.
I'm a Time Lord. I'm not a human being. I walk in eternity.
Bravehearty.
Change, my dear, and it seems not a moment too soon.
Unlimited rice pudding.
Position healers.
Wearing a bit thin.
Fantastic.
I am Scottish. I can complain about things.
Ta-da! Ooh. Should be fine.
Hi, I'm Dom Bettinelli, and you're listening to The Secrets of Doctor Who, where we discuss everything about the hit BBC series, Doctor Who, and today we're discussing the first Doctor story, Planet of Giants. And joining me today on the panel is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom. I think today I am the panel.
Yeah, that's right. That's Father Corey. He's very busy these days, and so we have to accommodate his schedule. I mean, you know, he's a pastor. He thinks that his parish comes first, you know? Come on.
Such delusions.
Yes. So we do miss him, but we're going to carry on so that we can be sure to have stuff for our listeners to have to listen to.
We're going to keep calm and carry on.
That's right. So I do want to mention first that if you are listening to this, you know, on the website or just from a file that someone shared with you, be sure to subscribe to the show in Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn. You can now get us on Spotify and iHeartRadio. You can find us on your favorite podcast app or on our YouTube channel, the SQPN YouTube channel, where you should hit the bell to be sure to get notifications. Let's talk about this episode. This is the first episode of the second season of Doctor Who, the first serial. I get confused, you know, when I'm talking about Classic Who, where a story would carry on over several episodes. This one has 3 episodes in this first story.
Mm-hmm. And they filmed it as 4, but they thought it didn't work as well as 4, and so they cut it down to 3, and it actually works pretty well. It doesn't drag the way some Classic Who can as much.
Yeah. Classic Who often has these long moments of just not much happening, as TV generally did. TV was not as fast-paced as it is today. This had a little bit of a faster pace to it, although it didn't feel rushed at all because it is, after all, 50-year-old TV. So,
and children's TV at that.
Yes. We have still the Doctors traveling with Susan, Ian, and Barbara. It's the first episode that is set in contemporary England, mid-20th century, 1960s England, since the very first episode of the first season, Unearthly Child, because the Doctors have been trying to get back to England to bring Ian and Barbara home again.
To unkidnap them.
Yes. That sort of has been kind of forgotten, I think, in all of this idea that the Doctor actually kidnapped Ian and Barbara. So
now they've gotten home, basically. They're just the wrong size.
Yeah, there's this weird thing that happens where the Doctor is trying to, as he puts it, slip the TARDIS back into Earth in the middle of the 20th century. And the TARDIS doors open before the ship is properly materialized because of some kind of space pressure was too great as it was materializing. Yeah,
and so the space pressure shrunk them, it seems, and and the TARDIS. And this is neat. This is I really like this serial because it shows something that you don't normally see on Doctor Who. I mean, we know the TARDIS is dimensionally transcendental, so the inside is bigger than the outside, but they very rarely play with that concept. And this shows what the show could be in the early days before it had settled into the formulas that, you know, typically dominate a program once it finds its legs. And so this is kind of early experimentation. In fact, the idea for a shrinking episode like this is one that had been part of the original series pitch, and they ended up not doing it in the first season, but they do it now. And they don't do anything like this again, so far as I can remember, until Logopolis, the final Fourth Doctor story where we get the TARDIS shrinking again. And they don't fully explore it I don't think, until the 12th Doctor series, Flatline, where we have the TARDIS both shrunk and with the full-size Doctor trapped in it. So it's just the interface to the outside world that's shrunk, and with other two-dimensional stuff going on in Flatline.
I think, Jimmy, you've forgotten another example of this.
What's that?
When the Doctor and Leela shrunk to go inside his own head in The Invisible Enemy.
True, and they did use a component of the TARDIS for that, but the TARDIS itself didn't do it.
Oh, okay.
And these are all accidents where, you know, it's not deliberate. They're not deliberately trying to shrink themselves. And normally I'm not at all a fan of shrinking episodes of different sci-fi series, but I like this one just because it's so different from other Doctor Who. They have the characters interacting with giant models all the time. They can't interact normally. And this was inspired, by the way, by now the previous one where they shrink to go inside the Doctor's head in The Invisible Enemy.
Yeah.
That was inspired by the movie Fantastic Voyage.
Right.
This was inspired by a documentary called Silent Spring, which was about the effects, a very famous documentary about the effects of toxins on our environment. And so that's what we have in this, is there are some scientists who are making an insecticide that actually is way too powerful.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, so yeah, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was really this seminal work in the 60s and 50s and 60s that really, you know, people, I mean, we think about it now, we know, oh, you know, the environmental pollution and all that sort of stuff. That seems, you know, common knowledge now. But back then, it was groundbreaking. This idea that, you know, they wanted to, and we see the scientists we're in this episode who talks about we need to kill the insects because we're trying to grow more food for people, because we, you know, people who don't have enough food in the world. Mm-hmm. And without the recognition of, well, what are we doing to our environment when we're, you know, dropping all this poison in it? And so there is this clear message that this is a message episode. The message that the writer of this is trying to get across in the midst of having this fun, you know, journey through a world of giant things. And there's some clever moments in this. I have to say that shrinking down and walking around in a giant world is very 60s. This was there were several. In fact, there was a whole TV series built around the idea of of people being, you know, in a giant world. What was that called? I forget the name of it.
Well, Land of the Giants was one of them from the 60s. That was an Irwin Allen production, if I recall correctly.
Right.
I think it's broader than that, because I think children naturally are small compared to the world they're in. And I think a standard children's fantasy is, what would it be like to be really tiny? And there have been all kinds of books and TV shows and movies based on that premise. Like, you know, there's all kinds of children's fiction about elves and stuff, and what would it be, or gnomes, what would it be like to be that small? And then there are things like The Borrowers, you know, the classic children's book about tiny people with tails. Mm-hmm. And I think this is another manifestation of that thing.
Right. And like Gulliver's Travels, the classic.
Gulliver's Travels has that, and the flip side of being really giant compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
A couple of notes I had before we talk about the episode content specifically. This fits in between the Reign of Terror, which had the TARDIS crew back in the Reign of Terror that followed the French Revolution.
Right.
And it comes before the Dalek invasion of Earth, which is Susan's final story on the show.
Right.
As a regular. So this is Susan's next to last outing here.
And I have to say, you know, in this one, Susan is less screechy. I mean, she's still a little screechy, but she's got she's matured a bit since the first episode.
Yeah, or put another way, the writers have allowed her to mature a bit.
Yes. The actress has always been fine, but the writers, I think, are finally figured out how to write her. Unfortunately, at the end. Yeah.
Also, I wanted to comment, just to get it out of the way, on the science in this, because if you really were to shrink somebody down by space pressure, I mean, that sounds like it's some kind of spatial manipulation that would otherwise leave them unchanged. But that raises bunches of questions like, does Ian still weigh 180 pounds when he's an inch tall? And that clearly is not the case. They've changed mass here.
Right.
And so somehow they've lost mass. It must be the space pressure affects the Higgs boson particles in them or something to cause them to lose mass without ripping atoms out of their bodies. Also, there are all kinds of questions that they don't really raise in this. Like, if you're that size, how can you even breathe? Because air pressure is going to work differently.
Yep.
They do attempt to engage the science a little bit, which was part of their educational remit, because Ian points out that at their size, their voices would sound like a little squeak to people because their vocal cords are so short. They don't say that's why, but that would be why. And then they say that everybody else's voices are going to sound just like a low rumble to them. And it wasn't clear to me, is that because they're envisioning this as somehow speeding up the tiny people? I don't think so. I'm not sure why someone with normal-sized vocal cords would sound like just a low rumble. But apparently the time scale that the TARDIS crew is living on and the time scale everyone else is living on is the same. So they're not like speeded up. But it is a little inconsistent with regard to the science of this, but at least they're trying.
Yeah, I like that, and the fact that when someone approaches, they're just so big that they can't take them all in, and like a normal sized person, they can't take them all in. They were like a mountain moving around in shadows. I like that, and what it means is throughout this, the TARDIS crew and the normal sized people don't really interact directly. They could have had all this. The stuff where the big people see them and all of a sudden, oh my, and then there's all this interaction. But there's really two stories going on right next to each other throughout this, which is
that interlock.
Yes.
Because the heroes have to save the day and stop the bad scientist businessmen people, but they don't do it by directly confronting them. And we never get like a King Kong and Fay Ray moment where anybody picks anybody else up in their giant prop hand.
Right. Although I had to say that probably the biggest hero in this is the nosy telephone operator. She's probably the one.
Yeah.
Who saves the day. But we'll get to that in a moment. I do want to note that Susan tells, I think, Ian or Barbara at the very beginning, that the most dangerous moment in the TARDIS travel is the point of materialization.
Just like an airplane.
Just landing it is the hardest part.
Landing and taking off are the two most dangerous points. The middle is not nearly as dangerous.
That's right. There is a moment in this when the space pressure and things are going wrong, the Doctor snaps at Barbara like he has, but this time he apologizes to her and he says, I sometimes forget the niceties under pressure. That feels like a definite effort by the writers, again, to kind of soften the Doctor's edges a little. He comes across in that first season as kind of, well, not even kind of, very prickly and very... and maybe that makes him less amenable to the audience, so they're trying to soften that a bit.
Yeah, like they learned their lesson with the first Doctor. They should have remembered it with subsequent prickly Doctors. The prickly Doctors are not the fun Doctors,
right? And they end up having to ameliorate that a bit as they go on. So after they land, they kind of explore. They don't realize that they're small yet. And they encounter these like these giant creatures. Oh, that looks like a giant earthworm. It's just a regular earthworm.
They think they're on another planet because it's got all these giant creatures.
Right. So they find a giant ant. Both are dead. So that's significant.
Yeah, and I'm like, good that ant is dead. That thing has formic acid in them. At your size, that formic acid would be deadly. Yes.
Not to mention the strength of the ant and you being potentially food. And then it's when Ian and Susan discover a giant sign, quote unquote, which is really just a box or something or a piece of paper.
It's a seed packet for night scented stock, and that's a kind of flower.
Okay. And it has a reference to Norwich, England, and so they realize they are on Earth. And it's the Doctor who realizes that they're tiny before everyone else does. Ian thinks that they're at the World's Fair, where they're with the exhibition of a novelty exhibition of regular sized things made giant. which is kind of actually what has happened by the prop masters.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're about the size of an inch. They're about an inch tall. An inch to 6 feet might be the scale.
So 1/172nd scale.
Right. And in fact, all of the activity of this episode happens within the front garden of this house. So a cobblestone path, really, and then a small room off the house that's a sort of laboratory, and that's it. That's where everything happens.
Mm-hmm. We later, in this episode, get to see another environment, but it's like a room in somebody else's house where they've got a switchboard.
Right. But the TARDIS crew moves probably no more than about 15 feet in one direction in the course of this because they're so small.
Yeah, I like the reveal where they've encountered this giant stone. And they're going, why is this stone cemented to the ground? It's got cement under it, but surely the stone itself is so massive you don't need to cement it in place. And then we get this pullback, and we see, it's part of a walkway in somebody's garden.
That's right. And it's again that idea of if you look very closely, it's like an alien world, but it really is the mundane world of someone's front yard. And then Ian ends up. First, he gets caught in a matchbox. He hides in a matchbox that he finds.
I like the giant matches, and
yes.
Like there's one of them burned and stuff. And these are the old fashioned like kitchen matches, so they've got wooden handles and stuff.
Right, and he hides because these two men show up, these giant men, and then we switch perspective to the normal size, and it's these two men are involved somehow with the creation of this new insecticide. That one of them is I guess he's a government inspector. He's
a civil servant. His name is Pharaoh, and his job is to evaluate the effects of this pending government approval. So he's like one of the key people to determine. He doesn't make the decision, does it get approved, but he writes the report recommending whether it gets approved. And he's realized the problem with this stuff. It's called DN6. And it is too deadly. It doesn't just kill the bad insects, it kills all the insects for the ecosystem it's released in.
Right.
And so he is going to disrecommend to the minister of his department that it be approved. And that really gets up the nose of this other guy. He's a businessman named Forrester who wants it approved because he's heavily invested in it, and it will ruin him if it's not approved.
I have to say that so there's these two guys, Pharaoh and Forrester, and then the scientist later on, Smithers, who are all very cold, very emotionless throughout this. It's very reserved in all of their dealings.
Well, the British, especially in this period, had a reputation for being very reserved.
Yes.
Also, this is fascinating children's television. In other news, there's been a dispute about the taxation rates of outlying trade routes in another part of the galaxy.
Exactly. Yeah, I can imagine kids being so thrilled to sit through these discussions of the destructiveness of.
Someone should put through a vote of no confidence in the Senate.
So the Forrester it will be ruined if Pharaoh writes this report. So he tries to bribe him, which gets Pharaoh very upset. And so if he can't bribe him, he shoots him. And it's a fairly bloodless kids TV shooting. I mean, although it is a murder, but he does shoot him, and it's very interesting how they find the TARDIS crew encounters the dead body. They walk up to Pharaoh is laying in the dirt. Forrester went off to do whatever, I don't know. But Pharaoh is now laying in the dirt, dead, obviously dead. And the way that they film this is they project Pharaoh's head on this giant projector screen, and then the actors stand in front of it.
Yeah, it's rear projection.
Yeah. So it's very clearly, not, it's not green screen. This is all practical effects. This is all right there on the camera. So it's a very primitive way of doing it. But so it's interesting to see. The doctor and everyone else, they encounter more dead bugs, presumably killed by this DN6. Ian is suddenly back with the others. I'm not sure how. They've cut something out there.
No, they got him. They paid that off. They have to walk to where Ian is, to where the matchbox has been taken.
Okay, when I was watching, there was a sudden jump from one thing to, and then suddenly Ian was there. There's whenever you have a story of people who've been shrunk, there's always a cat. It's just it's like a requirement. And so in this, there is a cat, although the doctor tells them not to look into the cat's eyes, and I'm not sure why.
Yeah, I know. I have that in my notes too. He's like, don't look in the cat's eyes. Close your own if you want to. And I'm going, why? Then you can't see what the cat's doing.
Exactly.
I mean, is the cat going to hypnotize you? Maybe this is some legend about cats they had in mid-20th century England or something, that they can stare you down or something.
Yes, it's right. And then the cat walks away. I mean, it's like the cat is the cat is the cliffhanger for the first episode. But they then the cat walks away, and there's no more. The cat doesn't enter the story at all after that, which is kind of funny.
And it's like in a cheap horror movie where you get a jump scare and it turns out to be the cat.
Yes, yeah. Ian and Barbara end up hiding in the dead man's briefcase, and I have to say the sets in this are fantastic. All the blown up things very large. It would be difficult to ensure that the scale is always correct, but everything looks really good.
Yeah, I forget if it was this episode that I read was like had more modeling than in any previous Doctor Who episode or something. Maybe that was a different episode, but the giant props are really impressive with the briefcase, and they've got this giant leather fold, from the top of the briefcase, and the giant matches, the giant dead bee, the giant dead ant, the giant dead earthworm. Right. It's all really nicely done.
Right. And the fly that actually moves, the one that isn't dead when they first encounter it. So then we have this Ian and Barbara end up in the laboratory. Forrester carries the briefcase into the laboratory, and they get bundled about inside the briefcase. So they're all dizzy and stuff, staggering out after the briefcase gets in there. I like that touch. And then Barbara touches the seeds, these seeds that are in the laboratory, wheat seeds, I think they are.
Yeah, they're wheat.
That are obviously covered with the insecticide. And then she sees a fly, which makes her faint. Like this kind of funny moment.
Yeah. And it's a little odd that there's insecticide on these seeds, because what you do with insecticides is you spray it on the adult plant so that the bugs don't eat the adult plant. But these are seeds that they haven't been milled yet, but they're out of the stalk. They're just detached seeds that have been harvested and rolled. Probably someone rolled them in their hands to, separate them from the chaff and stuff.
Right. I wonder maybe there was, they were going to experiment with it and feed it to bugs or something like that. But just leaving it out seems like a bad idea. Meanwhile, the Doctor and Susan are trying to reunite with Ian and Barbara, who ended up inside the lab, and they find this drain pipe coming out of the laboratory into a drain. Like, this laboratory does not have proper plumbing. Let's just say that right off the bat.
Yeah.
So
and they can climb up the drain because they've been pouring chemicals down it, and that's abraded the sides of the pipes. So there are lots of handhold and footholds that the Doctor and Susan can use to climb up. And I'm going, there might be chemical residue in all of those handholds and footholds. Are you sure you want to be exposing yourself to that at this size?
And in fact, the Doctor says, like, the first time he goes in the pipe, oh, it stinks in there from all the chemicals. Like, yeah, then maybe don't go in. This climb, by the way, has got to be one epic climb. This is like climbing up the side of a building here. We're free climbing it, no less. With a Doctor in a cape as an elderly man. So I'm very impressed.
Yeah. By the way, we should mention what's going on in the other parallel story at this point. So the civil servant has been killed, and then this scientist who developed DN6 shows up. And that's Smithers, you mentioned him. And he is interestingly morally amoral.
Yes.
Because he realizes that Forrester has murdered Pharaoh, and he doesn't care because he's too ruthlessly scientific, but not with science as its own goal, like most mad scientists. Instead, his goal is to save people from dying of starvation. And so if one man dies of acute lead poisoning, but it allows him to save people from starvation, he's okay with that. So
Right.
they like are dealing with Pharaoh's body, and the plan is for Forrester to take. Pharaoh was about to leave on a vacation. He was going to cross over to France in his boat. And so Forrester's plan is to take the body out and dump it and turn the boat over somehow at sea.
Right.
And then it will be like he just died on his vacation. And so
Right.
no one will realize he was murdered.
They'll just find his body floating, at which point I go, with a bullet hole in him.
With a bullet in it, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like you haven't thought this through very well. Yeah, and Smithers is all, he's upset that they might get discovered, but he's not upset that this man is dead. It's very, very cold. That's what I was saying before. They're very emotionless. Well, the Doctor and Susan, they climb up into the sink. So luckily, that drain pipe goes directly from the outdoors right into this sink in the laboratory. And they climb up through the sink drain pipe. And Ian and Barbara, this isn't one of those old sinks that has a stopper on a chain. And so they're going to climb down the chain into the sink because, of course, it's so far. It's so tall for them. But then Forrester and Smithers come into the lab to wash their hands of Pharaoh's blood. They've disposed of the body or hidden the body. And so they have to scramble back up out of the way. And the Doctor and Susan have to climb back into the drain pipe to avoid, the being seen. But, of course, they're about to wash their hands. And, what's going to happen? And it turns out they've
drowned.
Right. They puts a stopper. They puts the Smithers puts the stopper in the sink to wash his hands. I don't know about you, but I don't generally wash my hands.
Not
in a
if I'm
sink
trying
full
to
of
get
water.
blood off of them.
No, I let the water just flow. But okay.
Yeah.
But then he pulls the stopper and the sink drains, and you're like, oh no, the Doctor and Susan have drowned. Well, it turns out that they've gone into the overflow pipe on the side, which is a very clever recognition that every sink has one of these overflow pipes. So
the purpose of which for people who, there's partly, overflow is just to redirect the water, but also, and this is something they don't really touch on, but also every typical drain like this, well, I guess this one might not need it because it doesn't connect to the sewer.
Right.
It just goes out into the garden. But if it connected to the sewer, then the Doctor and Susan would have had to navigate one of those bends
right
in the pipe that is used to keep gas from coming up into the house from the sewer.
Right. Yeah, they didn't talk about them having to go through that because that would have standing water in it that they would have had to swim through. So that's interesting. Yeah, good thing lucky for them they didn't have to do that.
I love though that they now that they have survived the drowning by getting into the overflow pipe, they come back up, and so the Doctor and Susan are literally up the spout.
That's right. They went up the spout again.
Well, and it's also British slang for something is up the spout if it's useless or beaten up or done for.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that one. That's a good one. So meanwhile, Forrester has to, call the inspector's office to, kind of throw them off. And he needs to impersonate this inspector. And he does so using the clever trick of putting the handkerchief over the mouthpiece of the phone because, that's effective.
Yeah, classic thing you'd see in movies back then. It's somehow using a handkerchief over the phone disguises your voice.
Yes, it does not. And in fact, in this, it doesn't work because the operator, this is back in the days when an operator had to connect you, and operators sometimes were nosy and listened to people's calls, and it doesn't fool the local operator. She says that this is, this isn't Mr. Farrow. It's not him at all. Interesting, she calls herself the strange operator. Did you notice that? That's a term. I wasn't familiar with that.
I thought it was maybe a place name.
Oh, maybe there's a place called Strange.
Or Strang or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, that could be it. Now, in the midst of all this, remember, Barbara has touched the insecticide, which is, a deadly chemical, and she's beginning to suffer the effects, and she doesn't tell everyone. Like, she keeps it to herself. Why is she not telling? This was, I think, a huge flaw in the story, because it makes no sense that she's not telling anyone that she's touched the insecticide.
Yeah, I don't know why from a storyteller's perspective they do that, because if she told people, then everyone else could worry alongside of her.
Right.
But they're very subtle about it. At first, they just have her looking uncomfortable, like she's afraid, but we don't know what of. And you kind of have to be an adult, to put the pieces together and figure out what she's scared about before they announce it late in the game. If they'd announced it earlier, the other characters could have worried alongside of her, and it would have created additional urgency. So I don't know why they don't. Maybe they thought it would be too scary for children if they announced it early, if the solution was still 3 weeks away in broadcast time.
Yeah,
but I don't know. It's not like those Sherlock Holmes stories where people irrationally, like the Sussex Vampire or the Yellow Face or things like that, where someone is irrationally holding back information that would otherwise collapse the mystery that Sherlock needs to solve. Here, there's no mystery to collapse. It's just, why isn't she telling people? Right.
I mean, it might be that at the very beginning, Ian kind of mocks the idea of course, you wouldn't be so dumb as to touch the insecticide-coated seeds, and maybe she feels foolish for having done so. But I don't know. At one point, she does. It looks like she's about to tell him, and then they get interrupted. I think when the doctor and Susan show up. But yeah, it doesn't make sense. So they decide that they need to alert the authorities to what's going on, that there's been a murder and that there's insecticide. And so the only thing they can think of is they need to call the police. I'm not sure why they think this is going to work. They want to use the telephone, but Ian has just said that no one's going to understand us. We sound like a squeak. So I'm not sure how they thought this would work.
Yeah, it's maybe, well, they try, when they finally do get through, they're shouting through the telephone and it's not really working.
Right.
So maybe they thought that the telephone was going to process their voices in a way. If you get really close to the telephone and shout into it with 3 of you shouting, maybe that's going to disturb the microphone enough in the telephone to transmit your voices effectively.
Right. But in the end, I mean, really, it's the operator who saves the day. And as I said in the beginning, she calls back on some pretense, and the constable is with her, and her
husband's the constable.
Yeah, her husband is the constable, and she talks to Forrester, who's disguising himself as Pharaoh, and they recognize that there's something with this. He's not really Pharaoh, and then the constable is going to at the end show up and discover Forrester holding a gun on Smithers, and everything falls away. If the Doctor and the TARDIS crew weren't there, this would all end up exactly as it did, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure. I think that the fact the TARDIS crew does a couple of things that contribute to the resolution. One of them is they do make the call, and we get this interesting procedural where they have to, this is an old style telephone with a cord and a receiver, and they have to somehow lift the receiver as a group, and then they use corks to
lever it, sort of,
to hold it off the cradle. And since it's such an old telephone system, they didn't have 999 at the time, which is the British equivalent of 911, so they couldn't call for emergency. But you also don't have to dial the operator. You can just jiggle the little things in the cradle that tell the cradle whether the receiver is off the hook or not, and that'll get you the operator. And so I think that's how they do that. And then I think it's the second call from the house that the Doctor and crew place that helps prompt the operator into further investigating. Right. So even though they can't make themselves understood over the telephone, she becomes aware something's happening out there we need to check on.
Right.
And also, they then have a plan at the end to
start a fire.
Yeah. And they blow up a can of they blow up a can of insecticide. It's not clear that it's DN6, but it's an aerosol can.
Right.
And we have another procedural where they've got to use a match to light a Bunsen burner and then burn through this can, which explodes and sprays insecticide into the face of Forrester, thus disabling him.
Right.
And things like that.
With the force of a 1,000-pound bomb, for the Doctor says, for us, this would be the force of a 1,000-pound bomb. which is a huge bomb. That is not a small explosion.
No. So we get one of those Rose Tyler run for your lives moments.
Yes. I did enjoy the Ian and Susan trying to light the match on the side of the matchbox.
Yeah,
like
they got to do it like a battering ram.
Right. And the doctor's giving instructions from the side, try a sharper angle. And Ian's like, I know what I'm doing. Stop badgering me.
He's like, Doctor, have you ever tried to lift one of these things?
Yes.
I'm going, well, actually, the doctor was shown smoking a pipe in the first serial. So, yeah, I think he's used matches before.
Yeah, well, not one that big, though. I mean,
not one that big, yeah.
That thing looked like the equivalent of a 6x6, piece of wood, which is would be a heavy piece of lumber. So the insecticide can explodes, blinding Forrester, letting Smithers, get the gun from him just as the policeman arrives.
Yeah. Also, Smithers has turned good-ish. By this point, because he's realized in investigating what's happened in the garden, he's realized that the DN6 has been killing all of the insects, including the ones you need to maintain an ecosystem, like bees that pollinate and earthworms that, process soil and things like that. And so he's now, willing to realize the problems with DN6, but Forrester is still so invested in it, literally and figuratively,
right,
that he's like holding a gun on Smithers.
That's right. Now, so once the policeman has Smithers and Farrow in hand, Barbara is become very sick by this point, and the doctor says that her white blood cells are too small to deal with the insecticide molecules, but if they get her back to normal size, the dose will be normal, and then she'll be fine.
Yeah, I don't think that's how this works. White blood cells go after invading organisms, not insecticide chemicals. Your kidneys process those.
Yeah.
They need to get her kidneys back to full size, I think.
Yeah, I might have imputed white blood cells, saying white blood cells. He says something about her, maybe he says her system. I don't remember exactly what it was, but yeah, it was...
Basically, he says they got to get her back to full size so her body can handle the dosage of the poison that she received. That's
right. And so on their way out of the lab, the doctor grabs one of the insecticide-covered seeds for some reason. And then the doctor, it's clear.
And he wraps it in his cape that he's been stylishly wearing all this time, so it's got a practical function in this episode.
Yes, capes. Take that, Edna mode. The doctor is clearly not sure whether he can reverse the effect of being made small, but is trying to put on a brave face for everyone. But then, of course, it works, and he's all excited, and everyone's very, very excited. And for some reason, they're in the TARDIS. As the TARDIS embiggens, the insecticide seed that they've brought inside shrinks, and presumably the insecticide molecules in Barbara also shrink as the ship and the people grow bigger. I'm thinking, why is that?
Yeah, I'm not. I was unclear on this too. It's an effective way for them to show the viewer we have returned to normal size since this other thing didn't get embiggened with us.
Right.
So it may be just that this somehow undoes the effects of the space pressure, and since the space pressure had never been applied to the seed doesn't get larger because it was already full size.
Right.
But everybody else who was compressed by the space pressure now returns to their normal size. I think that must be the idea here.
Yeah. What's interesting is, so in order to show that the TARDIS is small, they've put this tiny model of the TARDIS in the garden. But the trick is they use that tiny TARDIS as a representative of the full-size TARDIS in other episodes.
Yeah, anytime you need a real long shot.
Yeah, and so it's kind of funny. It's like, well, yeah, in other shots we try to pretend it is big, but now we're just really pretending it is actually as small as it really is. So I thought that was funny. And that's how it ends. The doctor's trying to, he's trying to use the scanner to find out where they've ended up. And his scanner broke because of the space pressure at the beginning of the episode?
Actually, it was stupider than that. They said at the beginning of the episode, the scanner broke, and it looked to me like it shattered.
Yeah.
And it's not shattered here at the end of the episode, so more evidence of TARDIS regeneration, I guess.
Right.
But what he said was, the doctor said it was like something too big for its frame. And I'm going, TV cameras look at things that are too big to fit in the frame all the time. It doesn't cause them to shatter.
Right. It was very strange, that initial one.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of that on the plot level was to keep them from looking outside and seeing that they were tiny and at ground level.
Yes. So they're going to materialize in some new place. They don't know where they are yet, and that's what we're going to find out in the next episode when they are with, like you said earlier, in the 22nd century, where the Daleks have invaded the Earth. In that story. So that brings us to the end. Jimmy, do you have any further notes that you want to talk about?
A few little things. Another interesting bit of telephone technology from this time that plays a role in the story is after the TARDIS crew has propped the cradle or the receiver off the cradle of the phone, that means the line is engaged, and so when the bad guys try to make a call, they can't. And that was because at the time, matter, even if you had multiple phones in a house, if one of them is off the hook, you do not get a dial tone and cannot dial out. There were no multiple lines, no call waiting. Nobody could communicate with you if even one phone was off the hook, which is why people would leave their phones off the hook when they didn't want to be disturbed.
And back in the day when with modems and dial-up, that was always a problem because someone inevitably would pick up the phone in the middle of your, AOL session.
Oh,
back in the day too. Yes, all the lines would be connected.
There's a moment of interesting. I always hesitate to leap too quickly to this conclusion, but we do have a moment where Barbara and Susan are trying to climb up to look over a rock in the walkway. And the doctor won't, even though he's clearly much more frail than Barbara is, who isn't even poisoned yet at this point. It's like, oh, no, Barbara, I'll climb up because I don't want you to hurt yourself.
Chivalry.
And it's like, she's sounder of frame than you are.
Yes.
But let's see, there's also a moment where when they're going to blow up the can of insecticide, Ian says there'll be metal flying all over everywhere, and Susan says, it'll be just like that air raid, grandfather. And the doctor says, yes, what infernal machines those Zeppelins were. So apparently the doctor and Susan have been in a World War I air raid before, which we'd never seen.
Right.
And then there's a great line where after Smithers has turned good-ish, he tells Forrester that DN6 is more deadly than radiation. and I love that because as a scientist, he should understand. I mean, I guess you could say he's a chemist, but even then, he should understand the relative risks of radiation. I mean, this is the 60s, so it's right after the 50s with all the atomic mutant monster movies.
Right.
But there's a fascinating history, I guess, to how radiation has been perceived.
Yes.
When it was first discovered, it was like this mysterious energy that radiates off of stuff. And so what do you want to do with that? Let's use it to revitalize people. And so they would drink radium water, which was water that had been infused with a small amount of radium on the idea it was going to give you more energy.
They'd go to radium spas and sit in caves infused with radium rocks.
Yeah. So anytime someone tells you this has energy, so it's going to be good for you, remember radium water. Because what radium actually does, it sits in the same column of the periodic table as calcium, and that means it has the same number of electrons on the outer shell as calcium, and that means your body looks at it and thinks, this is calcium. Let's use it to build bones.
Right.
And so there's a famous case in the early 20th century of this millionaire who just was convinced radium water made him feel more vital. And he was rich enough to afford the stuff in cases and drank it every day. And it became an integral part of his jaw as a result, because when we chew, we stress our jaw. And so we're constantly building bone in our jaw.
Right.
And he got radium jaw, and it did not end well.
Yeah.
And eventually people got so scared, especially after the atom bomb, they became hyper vigilant about radiation, to where now people are even scared of cell phones emitting radiation, when in fact cell phones don't emit the type of radiation that causes damage. They emit radio waves. which is non-ionizing radiation. It's too
Right.
weak to knock electrons off the outer shell of an atom and create an ion, which is the dangerous stuff, like X-rays. And so, there's been this shift. And here in the early mid-60s, radiation has already been overtaken by that hypervigilance of DN6 is more dangerous than radiation, as if
Right.
radiation were uniquely and always very dangerous.
Right. I mean, there's all kinds of radiation, including the radiation of
Like
of
light.
and
Yeah.
heat from the sun. So yes, that is a funny phrase. It sets it very much in its time, and that's one of the fun things of watching these older episodes is it's the Doctor, but it's very much a product of the time in which the show was being made, and I that's one of the things I enjoy. Any other notes, Jimmy?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, let's wrap things up then. We want to first take a moment to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create The Secrets of Doctor Who, including Matthew J., Daphne M., Tim G., Ramses, and David W. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue The Secrets of Doctor Who and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. All right, so that's it from us. What did you think of Planet of Giants and our discussion of it? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Secrets of Doctor Who Facebook page, or you can send us an email to doctorwho@sqpn.com. We'll be back next time when we'll be discussing the second Doctor story called The Moon Base. And we're going to put a link in today's show notes to a special animated version or animation version that's available on Amazon that you could download.
So the Moon Base was a 4-part serial, and 2 of the parts, the footage has survived, but 2 of them did not. And so they went back and animated, like they did with the Reign of Terror, they animated the missing episodes and used the original soundtrack. And so we now have a nice, high-quality reconstruction of the Moon Base that you can watch.
Excellent. So that'll be next time. So if you want to watch that in anticipation of our discussion, that'll be available for you. So until then, Jimmy Akin, thank you for joining me and sharing the Secrets of Doctor Who.
Thanks, Dom.
And thank you for listening to the Secrets of Doctor Who on StarQuest. And remember, as the Doctor says, there's nothing like a good fire, is there?
Right. This is going to be fun.